So thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm excited and honestly a little bit anxious about talking about this tefillah. First of all, I think that the high holidays always come at you really quickly. So on the one hand, I feel crazy to be talking about Yom Kippur when we haven't even had Rosh Hashanah yet. But I'm here to tell you that they're both coming very soon, and we're not going to have a lot of time in between the two. And so on last week, we spoke about one major liturgical piece of Rosh Hashanah, which is the prayer of Hayom Harat Olam, and we talked about what that means and really built that out as a theme for the day overall. And today I want to talk about Unetaneh Tokef, which is a major prayer. I think you could maybe even argue, you could argue with me, but maybe not now, that it is the most central prayer of Yom Kippur. Interestingly, only for Ashkenazi Jews, though. So if anyone listening is Sephardi, it has like a backseat role, or is even sometimes not recited in Sephardi communities. But I think pretty solidly in the Ashkenazi tradition, this is a very important tefillah. And it's also a long tefillah, and it's also a complicated tefillah. And it's also a very, very, very intense tefillah. And so last time, one of the sources that we looked at put a particularly, I'd say, intense emotional spin on the tefillah that we were studying. And I said, this, comes with a content warning or a trigger warning. Here, I feel like the whole class is just one big content warning. So consider yourself warned. I think that Unetaneh Tokef is a very triggering prayer. The first time that I spoke about it, which was already a long time ago, so this might not indicate what would happen if you Googled it now. This was probably 2010, maybe. If you Googled, when Google will fill in the blank with your Google. So I was Googling Unetaneh Tokef and it was and cancer and death and is terrible, just one terrible thing after another. So that's your content warning. It's really a very intense tefillah. I was going to say, especially if something bad has happened, if you've had a loss, I was going to say in the last year, but really probably just ever. And since that probably covers most people, then, or something unpredictable has happened, then this is a really intense tefillah. It's a much longer piyut than the one we looked at last time. Last one was 32 words. We covered pretty much all 32 of them. This one is much longer. And it is an old tefillah, but similar to the last one we looked at, we don't actually know who wrote it. When I say we don't know, there are scholars who think they do know, but they just don't all agree. So I'm going to summarize that as we don't know. They're sort of the big three of piyutim from the Byzantine era, land of Israel, Paitanim, and possibly it was one of them or somebody who was imitating their style. So there are people who think it was Elazar HaKalir, and there are people who think it was Yanai, and there are people who think it was Yossi ben Yossi, and those are the big three, or it was some student of theirs. I put the first source, which we won't read inside, we won't read most of this inside. The first source that I put on your sheets is a paragraph from Professor Reuven Kimmelman. He's a professor he's a Judaic studies professor, but he does a lot of work on liturgy. And he sent me this. I'll tell you more about that later. But he wrote this intro to it, where he says that Unetaneh Tokef is to Rosh Hashanah what Lechad Odi is to Shabbat. Just want to think about that for a second. Does that feel like an accurate portrayal of your Yom Kippur experience, more or less? I guess I should first ask you if it's an accurate portrayal of your Shabbat experience, but how does the analogy work for you?
I never thought of it.
Never thought of it. I also never thought of it. So I'll let you guys sit with that for a little bit. I do think that it is it's not wrong. It's at least compelling enough for me to pause and want to think of it. And part of the reason for that might be this sort of terrifying aura that it brings with it. It's really I'll ask you in a little bit what it's about, but and we'll read it together, even though I suspect that at least part of it kind of, sings itself in your mind from year to year. I put also, like, as an intro, again, I won't read the whole thing, a piece from Chaim Soloveitchik, a very famous article that he wrote called Rupture and Reconstruction, which is essentially about the way that mimetic tradition, the way that the things that we get taught by the people in our lives is meant to be more important than the like learned book knowledge that we read. And he talks about how he grew up in a not very observant community. And later in life, he went to more religious yeshiva settings, especially in Israel. And he felt like everything was like more intense and better and more religious, except for Yom Kippur, except for basically Unetaneh Tokef, because he said like the people he was like davening with at these yeshivas in Israel, like they weren't really so scared. They were like davening and they were intense about davening, but they weren't like actually existentially terrified. Whereas the not very observant people who he grew up with, for whom the Holocaust was a strong memory, for whom like being wiped out was like felt like a real possibility, Unetaneh Tokef was like the most intense moment, right? Yom Kippur davening, you felt like they were really davening for their lives in a way that didn't translate in the communities of his adulthood. So it has both this real centrality, being like the central tefillah, definitional to the day, and also this feeling of being something which is, I think Soloveitchik would say, it's terrifying. And what's more than that, it's meant to be terrifying, right? It's not like you're meant to think, oh, like, you know, okay, it's like not so bad. It really is that intense. Yeah.
I was thinking a couple. I can't. Oh gosh, was that last week? How time is all.
Yeah,
funny.
time is crazy.
After there's the Rabbi Wolkenfeld was giving a drash during Tokef about the idea that there are some communities that don't even say these words.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I'll bet that's a community of largely Holocaust survivors. I could imagine that being something where it just feels too real and too.
Oh, that's interesting.
Real, like too close to.
You're saying maybe a community where it's so close they wouldn't say these words. I think what Chaim Soloveitchik is saying actually is that they were like more intensely focused on these words. But yeah, I mean, I could definitely imagine. I could like imagine skipping this prayer, and I could not imagine skipping this prayer.
But not even skipping it, how you respond differently in one way or another when it does feel more real.
Yeah. And I think that is why I found all these Google searches, because people who have had a very particular experience feel called upon to write about the juxtaposition of that experience with this prayer. And I didn't try Googling it, but I'm guessing it's not true for like the Amidah. It's really not true for like Aleinu. It's not true for like your average tefillah. It is true for this one because it really evokes those kinds of feelings.
Can I ask this question? But in reading this, it's almost like he's a little bit dismissive of the non-religious Jews who, I mean, he calls them mainly non-religious, who feel this fear at the last moment. And I don't think
that's
he's
interesting.
Actually
I think he's nostalgic for it, actually. Like, I think he's dismissive of them and their religiosity, but I think he is nostalgic for the feeling of, what does he call it? Sort of like the awe. Yeah. Right. He says the 10-day period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are now holy days, but they are not Yamim Noraim, days of awe, or more accurately, days of dread, as they have traditionally been called.
Because then he calls them that their tears were courtroom tears, with whatever degree of sincerity such tears have.
I think that the idea that we're just mentioning the Chaim Soloveitchik piece, that they were courtroom tears, I think that means, right, you're not necessarily sincere about feeling bad for the crime, but you sincerely want to be let off, right? I think that's the realness he's describing. Like, there's some phrase about like, you know, I don't believe in God, but if I did, I hope he does, like whatever, right? Like something like that. Like, you might not really be such a believer, but at the point at which you're in shul on Yom Kippur, you really would like God to let you live another year, right? Or whatever it might be. Though I don't think you're wrong that like, I think he's a little bit dismissive in his own way of both experiences. I find him in general to be very dismissive of most experiences. That's another story. Let's look at the tefillah a little bit. Okay. The way it's formatted, I did not just go crazy with color coding. I promise. A weird perk of my job, so I told you about a different aspect of my job last time. A weird perk of my job is that sometimes people just send me things. I don't always know what to do with them. So Professor Reuven Kimmelman, every once in a while, will just send me something that he's written or created and say like, hey, if you want, you can put this up on Sefaria. I don't know if I can actually put this up on Sefaria for all sorts of technical reasons, but I wrote back to him when he sent it to me and I said, thank you so much, Professor. I'm actually teaching about this. I will definitely, I'll definitely use it and I'll definitely credit you. So this is Reuven Kimmelman's like breakup of Unetaneh Tokef. I have no idea if it's published anywhere, honestly. He didn't tell me that part. So it was credited to him, but I don't know if you can find it anywhere else. And I didn't yet put in all of his citations and all of his essay on this. So I'll let you guys know when I've published that on Sefaria. But in the meantime, I decided to break it up the way that he broke it up. If we'd had Machzorim out, I would have just given you the Machzorim, but we don't, I was told. So I thought it'd be interesting to see it this way. So the color coding is his, the breakup of the lines is all his. Let's read at least part of it. Does someone want to read it? I won't ask you to sing it, but you can read it in the language of your choice. Did you just call on him? Yeah. Yeah.
He's led it.
Unetaneh Tokef Kedushat Hayom, Ki hu nora va'ayom. Ubo tinaseh malchutecha, v'yikom b'chesed kisecha, v'teshav alav ba'emet. Emet, ki tahu dayanu mochiach, v'yodea va'ed, v'choteh v'chotem, v'sofer umoneh. How far do you want me to go?
One more line. Let's get to his number 3.
V'tizkor kol hanishkafot, v'tiftach et sefer hazichronot, u'me'alav yikareh, v'chotam yad kol adam bo.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. That's like the first, according to Reuven Kimmelman, that's numbers 1 and 2 of this piyut. In a sentence or so, what's it about?
Setting the scene.
Setting the scene. And what's the scene that's being set?
God is getting ready to make decisions.
God is getting ready to make some decisions. And what's that decision-making process going to look like? Or what's the nature of those decisions so far?
The judge.
It's a judge. And I would say a judge, we already know that this is this is a judge who keeps records, right? So this is not just a judge who's going to it's not an umpire, right? Who's going to make the call on the field. I guess they keep records too. Okay, can you tell I don't watch sports? But you know what I mean, right? Like they're he's going to actually write down, God is going to actually write down the results of this judgment. Okay, keep going.
But my mistake, I skipped one. So
did you skip one?
I skipped the intro, which I think is probably an
important
point here.
He thinks so, yeah.
This is introduced into Kedusha.
Okay,
right? That
is an important point. It's introduced into Kedusha. And so the kinds of piyut piyutim fall into different categories without getting too technical. This one's a siluk, which is part of a piyut that goes into Kedusha. Kedusha, it's called a siluk.
Siluk.
Yeah. And it is part of this piyut that goes into Kedusha, right, which is that first part of the repetition of the Amidah. So that's when it gets said. So the punchline is going to be something about Kedusha, ultimately, in the long run. That's what we're going to go back to when we're finished with this long piyut. Okay, right. Want to pick it up from number 3? 3A?
V'chil urada yochezun. V'yomeru hine yom adin. Yifkod al tzvam aron badin. Ki lo yisku be'einecha vadin.
Okay, what's it about?
Also, the scenery. It's also a setup it's a description of the scenery.
Yeah, I think so. And I would say that if before, I'm sorry, we should have said people's names, but I don't know if everyone knows everyone's names. So you should just say your name when you speak. Before we had setting the scene, I would say a silent setting of the scene. And now there's sound effects added because there's a shofar now and there's a declaration. And also there's more characters because before we had God and now we also have angels. So we've further developed the scene. Okay, keep going.
V'chol bo'ei olam ya'avru lefanecha kivnei maron. Kivakarat ro'eh edro, ma'avir tzonot chachat shito, kein ta'avir v'tispor v'tineh, v'tifkod nefesh kol chai, v'tachtoch kitzvah l'chol bri yotach.
One more line. Okay, what's that about?
So now we know why we're here.
Now we know why we're here.
We know why we're here.
Now we're really into the meat of it, right? So we have this whole shepherd inspecting the flock. Does this change the theme for you, or is this the same theme?
It's a little more active.
It is a little more active because now we have a role, right? We kind of got introduced into the scene. Yeah.
It seems like it's kind of trying to touch on different senses.
Yeah, we added more senses in this time. I agree with that. Yeah. Anyone else for how this changes the scene?
You don't normally see sheep in courtrooms.
You don't normally see sheep in courtrooms. That's true. Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny almost that for such an intense prayer, we're really taking a long time setting the scene. I would say that like these things are adding, they're sort of layering on the scenery. They're adding incrementally. We're like not like there yet, right? And then we start off. I'm not going to have you read all of it, right? We start with the famous part, Rosh Hashanah Yikatemun of Yom Kippur Tichatemun, that we're going to be written on Rosh Hashanah and sealed. And then you have the really, is it okay to call this the really intense part? How do we feel about that? Yeah, right. How many, right? This is the whole who will live and who will die part. And you get the gory descriptions of all the different ways that people might die were they to die in the coming year. And then read us the punchline, number 7. So tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah can annul or perhaps push off or mitigate the evil decree. And then it goes on to talk about sort of the frailty of human life, I would say, and ending with God's kingship again. So we go back to God as the central character. I mean, not that God's not the central character throughout, but really the only character again by the end. And that is kind of the end of the story. I think we're left roughly where we began, with God in this judgment role, God in this kingship role. But it takes us kind of like a long time to get there. Okay. So the first thing to know, I think, about this tefillah before we can like move on to what's actually happening during it is that this tefillah has a very famous and sort of like historically dubious, but very fun and famous backstory. So maybe you know the backstory. It's often printed in Machzorim. I gave you like an abbreviated English version, and I put the Hebrew on because that's the kind of crazy person I am, because I just couldn't not put the original on, but I didn't have time to translate it. So anyway, it's the same story. Basically, it's a story of a rabbi named Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, who we think didn't exist so much, but you don't want to let that ruin a good story. He was a great rabbi. He was approached by a local bishop, and he was asked to convert. And the bishop kept asking him to convert. And he said, I'll come back and give you an answer in 3 days. And then he was so angry at himself, so disappointed in himself for even saying that he might convert, that he decided not to go when the 3 days were over. And so the bishop, of course, like hauls him off to wherever the bishop lives and says, why didn't you do this? And he says, I was never going to convert. I shouldn't have even implied that I was going to convert. And since I implied that I was going to convert, you should cut out my tongue. That's the only reasonable punishment. To which the bishop, I guess at that point, reasonably replies, well, actually, the thing I think you didn't do, you didn't show up for me. So let's cut off your fingers and toes. And, it sort of goes on from there. There are different versions of the story. At some point, he's dismembered. He's carried on a knight's shield to the Jewish area. And on Rosh Hashanah, he asks to be placed next to the Shaliach Tzibor, next to the prayer leader. And when the leader is about to recite the Musaf Amidah, or the Kedusha of the Musaf Amidah, this rabbi asks to add a prayer so he can sanctify God's name, which was like, right, that's like the Midah Keneged Midah, right? That's the, how do you say that in English? It's like the just desserts or whatever. Isn't going to sanctify God's name. He wasn't, my Zoom is frozen. Okay. He was prepared to maybe convert, which is like the thing you're not supposed to do, right? Instead, you're supposed to sanctify God's name, maybe. And so he feels like as punishment, like to counteract that right now, he's going to sanctify God's name. And so he comes up with this prayer, this Unetaneh Tokef prayer, like on the spot. recites it, and then asks that be recited, forevermore in this time slot. During, okay, here it's Rosh Hashanah, maybe it's Yom Kippur, maybe it's both, whatever it is. And that's kind of the backstory. Okay, again, there probably was not a Rabbi Amnon of Mainz. You're shrugging, right? Okay, fine, right? Maybe he was actually an Italian figure. Certainly there seem to be aspects of this story that reflect its composition, either during the time of, or maybe like after the Crusades, because the Crusades were kind of like, right, if you think about like the Holocaust now and all the tefillot and all of the ritual that we've constructed around that, if you look at the ritual like we already have from a long time ago, right, that's like mostly, a lot of it is constructed around the horrors of the Crusades. That was their big tragedy. And there's a lot of, I guess the biggest thematic echo is this idea of dying al kedushat Hashem, sacrificing your life to sanctify God's name. Okay, it's like a little weird here, but it's like similar, right? The Crusaders wanted them to convert. They didn't convert, so they killed them. Here he decided not to convert. He was asked to convert. He decided not to convert. And so he decides that he, could be killed rather than, or, could suffer this terrible death as a way of sanctifying God's name. That's the very famous backstory. And that is, I think, according to some, and I'll be curious to hear if you agree, I think the story is kind of grotesque. Although again, the tefillah is quite intense. Some people think that this story is why the prayer is still recited. When we get to Shavuot, I'll try to convince you that sometimes not so impactful prayers with really good stories stay around in the liturgy for longer than you might otherwise think. This prayer, I think, is intense even on its own, but it has a really good backstory. So how does knowing this story change how you read the prayer, or does it not change how you experience the tefillah?
So he's a real person.
Right.
How devoted he was to Hashem, and therefore was willing to be tortured to death rather than to convert.
Right. Except it was sort of self-torture, but yes.
Yeah, but you have to figure out which one of the various listings of
death
yes. He fits into.
Yeah.
Who by not earthquake, who by plague.
So many options.
Yes.
Right. I think you're right. I don't think
to a low state.
I don't think that the story really echoes the narrative of the prayer so much. That's my personal feeling. Though it does explain why it's situated where it is in this part of Akdusha, both explain in the in the narrative sense, like, oh, because that's when it happened, right? That's when the story happened, but really explain more in the thematic sense, right? Why is it in Kedusha? Because it's about Kiddush Hashem. Yeah.
So I see it a little differently.
Yeah.
If you all could.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I see both the story and the prayer as a deliberate attempt to cause you to be emotionally stirred. Sort of like the Asara Harugei Malchut, similarly, a not exactly historical accounting of tragic death on Kiddush Hashem, inserted into the prayer and some Matzurim, for the sole purpose of sort of getting you
worked up.
And so
yeah.
I kind of see that the story and the
that's interesting. The story and the prayer have similar goals.
They have a similar goal, which is to invoke Yom Norava Ayom.
Yeah, I like that. I accept that. I guess I think that to me, the story is like grotesque, but like not like actively scary. The prayer is like actively scary. But I like that. I agree that there's like an echo there of like, here's something that's meant to really capture your attention and really focus your thoughts on this moment and on this day. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else on that piece? Yeah.
I think the story highlights like degree of teshuvah that the rabbi had. I mean, this is the Tommy Chacham and
right,
like,
and he did tshuva,
and just because he, staved off this bishop for 3 days, like just stalling, like he felt that enormous guilt about what that implied, and he felt that he deserved to be punished like this.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So
like he did tshuva, that's like a model for us,
right? And
yeah,
like, and God didn't forgive him for that because he took them.
I actually think it's a really interesting question. God doesn't show up in the story.
Well, I thought at the end it said he was taken by God.
Oh, you're saying because God, right, at the very end, right? I thought you meant like in the process. Yes, at the end, he's like taken by God and disappears from the world, a la Eliyahu Hanavi. Yes.
Are there other stories about the origins of the prayer?
Of this prayer?
Or is this the only one?
No, this is the story. This is, I mean, there are scholarly writings about maybe who actually wrote the prayer, but there's no other story. This is the story.
Because then maybe we have to think about what was the thinking behind the person who put the story together at that time. What was the message they were trying to give their congregation?
Right. Yeah. Yes, and I think we don't really know because we don't even know exactly where the story originated. But again, it seems to have a lot of post-crusade themes. So I think that you can say that there's like, right, for the community. And again, this I can only really relate to as like, someone who grew up with the communal trauma of the Holocaust. Nobody in my family died. So for me, it wasn't a family trauma, but it was such a close communal trauma that I feel like I can relate to what that feels like. And for them, it was the Crusades. Right. Even if you didn't have, an ancestor who'd actually been killed, the fact that these entire communities were wiped out, right? Mainz was one of the communities impacted by the Crusades. So even, it's maybe a reason to attribute it to somebody who lived there to bring it even closer, right? To bring that narrative even closer. So I agree with you. Whoever the Paitan was and whatever the impact of the story, when you go a little deeper into the text, I guess it seems silly to say there's a lot there, but there's really a lot there. I mentioned in the last prayer that we looked at that there's not a lot of biblical resonance between Hayom Harat Olam and the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. That is not the case for this tefillah. So whoever wrote this prayer is pulling things right and left. Like there's tons. If you look at a fully, I've not seen a machzor here yet, so I don't even know what our machzorim here look like. You guys can all add that information in for me. But what, Karin? Okay, so I think Karin does do some citing, right? I don't know if they have every line here glossed, but pretty much every line you could have at least one verse for, if not multiple verses. So you could pull up again, you can this is a game you can play at home, right? Just to pull up all the different verses that potentially speak to, echo, are echoed by this prayer. I wanted to just pull out a few of them because we definitely don't have time for all of them. So first, I wanted to think about this idea of judgment. And I really liked what you said about like setting the scene and like God is the judge. And that's what's happening in this tefillah. I think also I am not as drawn to the Rabbi Amnon story. And so I also was looking for a different narrative to kind of attach this prayer to. So Professor Kimmelman, among others, it's like a sort of, you can find a lot of scholarship on this, make the connection between this tefillah and the story of Esther. So you can look at the psukim or not, but tell me, I'm going to say you probably all know more or less the story of Esther. It's like either very fresh in your mind or not very fresh in your mind. My 6-year-old came home from school and said, Ima, next week is Purim. And I was like, maybe Rosh Hashanah? And he was like, yeah, that one. So, right. So for some of us, it's fresher than others. So what resonances are there between the Purim story and this?
Thinking is what that is.
That was wishful thinking, right? It's like so close and yet so far. But I think, the more you look at it, I think you can see resonances between this tefillah and Esther's experience, which is also like a story that we know. So what parallels do you see or resonances? You can look at the psukim these are not the only psukim, but these are some of the verses. So the missing piece at the beginning of the piyut, uvechein, right? Uvechein, which is a slightly weird formulation. I don't even have the grammar to really translate that. It says, and thus unto you, uvechen ulecha. There's a lot of
where are you?
It's the word prepositions going on there. So I'm looking at the very first line of the piyut. So on page 2, but then if you compare that to I didn't number the sources. Okay, if you compare that to Esther 4:16, Esther chapter 4, verse 16, where she's just saying to Mordechai, okay, I'm going to do this thing that you told me to do. It's a really bad idea, by the way. So she says, ותשומו עליי ואל תאכלו ואל תשתו 3 ימים לילה ויום, גם אני ונערותיי עצמכם, ובכן אבוא על המלך אשר לא חדלת, וכאשר עבדתי, עבדתי. Right? I will, ובכן, right? I'm going to come to the king, asher lo kadat, against the rules. It's not a perfect parallel, but you have a human, you have a king. He's also a human king, but human kings can be terrifying too. I say this with zero actual experiential knowledge, but I think it's clear from the story of Esther that she's pretty scared, and also that King Achashverosh actually does have the power to kill people. That's definitely an implied piece of the story. I don't think he doesn't really do a lot of killing until the end of the story, right? But throughout, there's this idea that he could do that. And the uvechen there is I'm going to stand in front of the king. And what's going to happen if I stand in front of the king? I might die, right? I might die if I stand in front of the king. So it is a life or death situation. You also have actually throughout Esther, I didn't even there's a lot of different references throughout the book of Esther to writing things down. That's actually a sort of distinguishing feature of the book of Esther, I would say, as opposed to much of Tanakh. Different class for a different time, the theme of writing in the Bible. Actually, the Bible spends a fair amount of time, but not so much the other prophets, but Esther's really fixated on writing. And so the idea of, I didn't do a count, but probably one of you could. How many times does it say to write and to seal in the book of Esther as compared to the entire rest of the Torah? I think writing and sealing things is not, I feel, a major theme of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, but it is probably the theme of the book of Esther. Right? Right? Anything that is written and sealed in the signature of the king, in lahashiv, right? You can't ever reverse it. It's irreversible. It's even worse in some ways than God's decree, which we're kind of saying is changeable, is I want to say mitigatable. I don't think that's the word. Can be mitigated in some way, as opposed to the kings, which cannot be. The king, Achashverosh, has a Sefer HaZichronot, has a book of remembrances, which is the book, right, is part of the image of these books that we're asking God to write us in, or God to look through, the Sefer HaZichronot. And actually, I put that verse in, or on that night the king's sleep was disturbed. But he asked for the Sefer HaZichronot to be brought so we could have it read to him. I read Megillah, and when you read that verse, the custom is to read the word melech there in the Yamim Noraim tune. You must also be, you're nodding, and also a Megillah laner, right? So you say, you sing that word as though it were part of the liturgy of these days, because we actually want to suggest a resonance there between Achashverosh and God, which sounds kind of crazy if you're really thinking about the character of Achashverosh, who was neither supremely talented, nor supremely brilliant, nor supremely successful. But the Midrash tells us that on that night when the Sefer HaZichronot was opened before Achashverosh, God was also kind of looking through God's own records. And to me, the most interesting part, because I'm really not a grammarian, is I could not think of or easily find another, there's a few other places actually, but the most common instance that I know of the word tokef, we didn't talk about this, Unetaneh Tokef kedushat hayom. What on earth does that mean? I've got Netaneh, that's like Natan, like to give. I've got kedushat hayom, that's the holiness of the day. How about tokef? So multiple times. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, in modern Hebrew, that's like attacking, like litkof, no?
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think that's what it means here. I mean, it's similar, right? I think it translates it as, it actually says the great holiness of this day. I've seen the great force of this day. And in the Megillah, it seems to mean authority, right? They wrote the whole tokef, they wrote the whole force or the whole authority. I don't think it's an attack, but I think it could be like a similar root, right? That it's like coming from this idea of writing something down that's really forceful. I think actually the translation here, almost like the translation of the piyut, almost like skips over that word, right? Unetaneh Tokef kedushat hayom. If you read this as, right, the question is like, who do you want to align yourself with in the story of Unetaneh Tokef? Who do you imagine yourself to be in the story? So I guess one possibility is Rabbi Amnon, because he's the like hero or anti-hero of the backstory. But I want to suggest that I think that the prayer itself is suggesting that another possibility is, at least for like a moment of the prayer, maybe not for the whole time, that we're kind of like Esther. We're standing before a king. We're going to be judged. There's a lot of potential for writing things down, things having been written down. There are also like enemies in play, right? Like not all the forces are aligned with you. And again, I don't know that it reads as like a full narrative through the tefillah. But I think there are certainly moments that are meant to, like, you're meant to have like an Esther moment at some point in the course of this tefillah. Thoughts or questions?
Is there an Esther moment?
I think an Esther, meaning like that feeling of like standing before the king. And I think we're meant to be reminded of the story, which, you know, I think to the extent that, so another part of the backstory, not the like sort of legend backstory of this piyut, but for piyutim in general, there was a major medieval campaign to wipe out the recitation of piyutim. A lot of the, especially like the Spanish grammarian types, did not like them at all. And Ibn Ezra, for example, has some very choice words about like how terrible it would be to recite these prayers. And I think that, and also, okay, maybe not this one, because this one, again, I think you can all sing in your head. But if for any of you who are at Slichot, was that last night? Mm-hmm. Or is that why I'm so tired? Okay. Right. So they're very wordy and they're very long. And we actually have historically cut out a lot of them. So the ones that we still say, like you have to kind of relate to those as like the survivors. Right? Like these are the ones that somehow made it through. They made it through despite real campaigns by like important people to try to wipe them out and not say them anymore. And they made them through despite being very long and having a lot of words, and we don't know what all the words mean. And we might not ever really know what all the words mean. And so I think like any place where there's like a resonance, like, oh, that's a character who I remember Esther, right? Like that's like a familiar story. I don't have to be like the greatest expert in like the scroll of Esther to remember the basic narrative. And so I think like having an Esther moment is where you like see that glimpse of like, oh, that was a terrifying story also. And I see that in that prayer and can kind of locate myself within that narrative. Yeah.
So I have another problem with Unetaneh Tokef.
Yeah.
That I would be on the side of we need to eliminate it from the prayer.
Yeah. For
the very reason that you got to ask, well, is it true?
Yes.
Like, does our religion truly believe that whatever is written and sealed on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is your fate for the year, and then deal with it? Or does it say, well, that's sort of one opinion, but inside itself, but don't worry, because Shuva Tefillah and Staka sort of undoes that, so you're sort of okay.
Right.
In which case you say, oh, well, if that's the case, then why did we start off with the thing that we aren't fine, right? It's, I mean, because at the end of the day, you got to ask yourself from time to time, well, is it true?
Right.
Well, or is it just stirring us up?
Yeah, I think that's very real. And I think that the question of like, is this true? I want to repeat for people on Zoom who might not have heard, right? Is this really what we think, right? Is Unetaneh Tokef really what we think? So just to summarize for a second what the this is, right? So first of all, you're buying that there's this whole like judgment process. God is a king. It's happening on this day. I am one of the people/sheep, right? Standing before God being judged. And everything is being decided in this moment, right? It's all comes down to this moment. So detailed, right? Like you said, like all the different ways that a person could, God forbid, perish, right? Like really okay, so maybe not all the ways, but it's a lot of the ways. Really a very detailed list. But then, like you're right, like just kidding, right? Tshuva tefillah tzedakah mavirin roa hagzera. So you'll never really know even what was decreed upon you initially if you do a good enough job, right? Like you can maybe shift the gzera to begin with, or like you'll never know what the original one was because from this moment on you'll shift it. And do we really even believe any of that? Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I think for that reason, well, I will say this, and you guys can all tell me if you think I'm wrong. I would say that probably most of us either don't believe or don't really want to believe that in that moment, everything is decided and you can't change it at all. How's that? Any one of those signs that says like, fight me. Yeah.
But I think it depends on when Tshuva happens. Is it before Yom Kippur?
Right.
Or is it after all these things are decided and but not quite sealed? And then I guess there's the philosophy that you still have how many days after Yom Kippur?
It's like the 18 minutes, right? Like you light candles, but you actually have more time. So like your fate has been sealed, but don't worry, you actually have, a little bit longer to kind of sneak in under the wire. Yeah, maybe, right? And maybe that's a way of saying
I don't remember.
Well, it's to the end, yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that what Hoshana Rabbah could be?
That's kind of what Hoshana Rabbah is, yeah.
Okay.
Or some people say Shmini Atzeret, yeah. So really like you have like an extra couple of weeks. Yeah, so do we really believe that? Yeah.
I don't know. I'm more comfortable with the idea of the fate being sealed than the idea that actions on one's part are going to change the heavenly decree after that, because that feels like a meritocracy where people who have bad things happen to them did it because they didn't give enough tzedakah or they didn't do tshuva, or as opposed to an idea that this is just like how things ended up.
That's really interesting. I thought that maybe you were going to surface yourself as a Maimonidean, which is like, you'll maybe learn like the major split in our marriage is that David is a Rambam person and I am not. So I would say like a Maimonidean would also really not like the idea that you can influence God's decree, but you're saying, I think something even like a little bit more intense, which is like just like, then it's like, well, just because you gave more tzedakah than I did, right? Like really, like you had maybe more time to do tshuva because, whatever, you just didn't have to work that week, right? Like really, is that what's going to shift it? Yeah. I think that is maybe the central question of this prayer. And I would say that actually, like a lot of biblical texts, what most thinkers actually do is they decide we really do agree with this prayer because we say it every year and it has been said every year by lots of people for a very long time. And so the only question is, how are we going to understand this prayer, right? So I'll crib on your question a little bit. There's a lot, again, okay, I'm going to skip a few sources. There's a lot that can be said about this. And I'm going to skip, in case you're following along on the source sheet, which I am really not, I will skip to the section on page 8 that says changing our fate. This is the part about all the writing, but it's interesting to note, I think this is to really all of your points, the original rabbinic sources that this tefillah seems to be based on have a slightly different way of framing it. Arba dvarim mikarin gzar dino shel adam is how the Bavli says it, or the Yerushalmi says Shlosha dvarim mevatzlin et hagzera kasha. The rabbinic sources, the Talmudic sources, say that there are either 3 things or 4 things, depending on what part of the world you're counting in, that will rip up or destroy the evil decree. These are things that can actually get rid of the evil decree. Maybe, but that's not what Unetaneh Tokef says. What does Unetaneh Tokef say? Ma'avirin et roa hagzera. It's like what you were saying, right? It's like it pushes it off. It defers. I would say like mitigates. Right? It doesn't make it necessarily all the way better. So I think to your point, Wilhelmina, we don't necessarily have the power to. It's not like you give. It's not like the giving levels. Like, like the bronze sponsor and the gold sponsor, right? Like if you're a gold sponsor, then like you don't get that decree anymore, but you have the chance, you have the power to sort of alter it, to mitigate it, to make it in some way better. And that's like a different twist on this idea, and maybe a slightly more palatable one, right? So we're not totally changing God's mind, as it were. But we are changing the impact that this like Zardin judgment, right? I guess judgment is going to have on the world and is going to have on us. And I think that's part of what this tefillah can do for us is meant to do for us. I'll leave it to you whether you think it does this or whether it has this impact effectively. So we've already like established that. I mean, you said, right, it's kind of almost like an emotionally manipulative prayer, right? Like it really, like, they know they've got you. And it has this whole litany, but I think that the if Unetaneh Tokef is kind of like the peak prayer moment of these holidays, then that line, Tshuva Tefillah Tzedakah Ma'avirina Roa Hagzera, that's the big reveal, right? That's like the moment. This is the thing that you're going to do that is going to somehow make it better. And so I think in thinking about it that way, the tefillah only works on some level, like works not on God, but works on us. If you can, I don't know if I want to say believe that, like get inside that narrative, right? Otherwise, it's just depressing, or it's just terrifying, or it's just an emotionally manipulative, right? Like anything could happen experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one word pair that Ruben Kilman may have missed is Ma'avirin.
No, I think he had it also. I might not have put it in, but yes.
Because that's an interesting verb.
Yes.
You're right, because you would have used a different verb that would have said nulled or ripped up or anything. But the fact that he uses this verb ma'avirin, which is weird. What does it mean to ma'avir to defer or mitigate a gzera, other than the ma'avirin is used before for the sheep?
Yes, ma'avirin is a weird word. And it's actually, I mean, I think someone said before, we'll get to some of the other prayers, we actually say this language of ma'avir. It comes up a lot in this time of year. Because what do we say? The Slichot books are probably still over there. I didn't bring one, right? But like right before you say the midot of God, right? The 13 attributes of God, right? So what introduces that? You have to scroll backwards in your mind. It's hard, right? So Vayavor Hashem al panav, right? God passes over Moses' face, right? There's a lot of ma'avirin. There's a lot of passing. And by the way, how do you say a sin in Hebrew? An avera, which is not a big Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur word, actually. I feel like we tend to use like chet, but we don't not use that word either. Right? And Avera is like, it's like a missed opportunity, right? There's all these things kind of passing you by. And it's a question of like, is it a good passing? Is it not good passing? I put the Gemara from Rosh Hashanah on here at the bottom of page 9. Rava Amar, Kol ha'ma'avir al midotav, ma'avirin lo al kol pisha'av. That anyone who, but see, it's a really hard word to translate. The English here, which I did not write, says, anyone who forgoes his reckonings with others for injustices done to him, the heavenly court in turn forgoes punishment for all his sins. Okay? So it's to forego. Anyone have a better modern English word for forego? No. Susan's like, nope.
Whose sins?
Whose what?
Whose sins?
Whose sins?
Or for injustices done to him.
Yeah, I think it
seems to be reflexive.
I think there's just too many men in the story, right? Like if I am very forgiving towards you, then God will be very forgiving towards me. Okay. Right. So that's ma'avirin. But again, like you said, it's a strange word.
I give you a pass.
I give you a pass. That's good. Yeah, I give you a pass, right? Like I'm going to let it go, right? To use a different popular tune. Right. I'm gonna just let it go. I'm not gonna hold on to it. And that's like a model for behavior in this time. I haven't seen anything written. It really just occurred to me last night during Slichot that this language of Vayavor Hashem al panav is also this language, right? That like something about God having given Moshe a pass almost, right? Like I haven't worked out exactly what the resonance is there, but I think that it is there because we repeat it so many times. I'm like, why is that such an important part of the story? Like it's not Moshe, it's not Moshe saw God, it's not Moshe spoke to God, right? Vayavor Hashem al panav. Right. So I think that ma'avirin is also part of the story here. Again, I think that question of like how do I actually take this and internalize it? If I either don't believe or don't want to believe that that gzar din, that judgment works this way, or if I do believe, right, and I want to believe in the power of repentance, right, tshuva, tefillah, utzedakah. So there's a famous story. I think it's been told in the name of so many different rabbis that I don't remember any of them anymore because like I don't think it ever really happened. But there's a story about a man who was a professional schnorrer essentially. Right? He went from door to door and got people to give him money. And there was one family that he went to every year in particular, and he would always say, "Tzedakah tatzil mimavet." I don't know if anyone's ever said that to you. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet is like an analogous statement to this tshuva tefillah tzedakah, right? Giving charity saves from death is how I would translate that. And he would always go on the high holidays. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet. This one family would always give him a great deal of money. He went to them every year. One year he went to discover that over the past year, the person who had given him all the money had lost several family members that year. And the person said to him, "I'm not giving you any money this year. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet," right? It didn't work out so well. It didn't work. And the schnorrer said to him, no, that's not what I mean. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet is real. You give me charity, and that saves me from dying. Right? Like, that is how that actually works. That is how tzedakah works. It doesn't necessarily save you from death. It saves me from death. For me, I think that story is a really important portal to thinking about this tefillah, because tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, ma'avirin et roa hagzera. I don't know what tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah, right, what these three things can actually do to like a heavenly decree, because I'm not exactly sure how heavenly decrees work. I think the ma'avirin language is very complicated, and I think, right, to sort of both of your points, right, like, do we really want to think that? Do we really think that, to your point, Belle, like what's the window on this? What's the return window on this, right? How long do I actually have? I think that these are very complicated questions. But the idea that tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, I'll use a different word for ma'avirin. I'll say like take the edge off, right? Like pushes aside the worst of the gzeirah. That feels to me like demonstrably real. Maybe not always for me in that moment, but in terms of thinking about the impact of my actions on the world. And Reuben Kimmelman also writes about this in writing about this tefillah, that tshuva is about like me and myself. That's about like me thinking about me. That's one important relationship that impacts how I interact with the world. Tefillah is directed towards God, and that's my relationship with God. And that also, of course, is going to impact my the way I interact with the world. And then there's tzedakah, which is, he calls it other directed. That's about how I interact with other people. So you can think about it as how much money did I give? But I think you could also think about it, right? Tzedakah really means righteousness. or justice, right? That's like the root. Tzedek tirdof does not mean give a lot of money. And it's about pursuing righteousness. And that's other facing. And that is something that, like, I would say, for sure is going to make the world better. For sure is going to make any gzeira, that is like any negativity in the world, it's going to mitigate that. Whether or not it like goes up to heaven and is like, you know, you get the check mark next to like, did you donate to the Yom Kippur? What do you call it? The Yom Kippur like campaign appeal. Thank you. Right. So whether or not you donated to the Yom Kippur appeal, that's like a check mark, yes or no. This is about actual impact that we can have on ourselves and on others. And I put a piece from Rabbi Sharon Brous on here, which I think that the whole book is actually worthwhile. It's a book about Unetaneh Tokef. Where I put it somewhere on here. It was hard to pick just one passage, so it's a beautiful passage. Let me put it somewhere here. On the last page 10. And she talks extensively. I cut some of it here about how challenging this prayer really is. And it's not just it's like the whole belief system, right? Do I buy it or do I not? How challenging it really is. And she goes through also, right? Tshuva is about you can make change in your life. Tefillah is you're not alone and you can open yourself up to God. And tzedakah is about, she says, like, it's not even giving. It's like really, it's about caring. It's about opening your eyes to the needs of others, sort of regardless of how much like actual money or actual resources you can devote to helping that. And she says, and this part I like sort of for sure feel like she's right, that the rabbis had this earlier version of these things will abrogate the decree. And like the Paitan, whoever wrote this prayer, wasn't willing to go that far. Like, I can't make that promise to you. I don't know what's decreed for the year to come. And I can't promise you that anything you do now is going to change it or not change it. And that's just like, bad things happen sometimes. Actually with some regularity, right? But hopefully not all in 1 year, and hopefully not to us, and all the other hopes that we have. But however bad things are, we have a capacity to put actions out into the world, to act on ourselves and our relationship with God and on others. And that, she says, is like what this tefillah is actually giving us, right? Is that reminder, whichever narrative version resonates with you. And again, there's a lot of other biblical allusions in this prayer that we didn't get to, but it's the reminder that we have the capacity actually to shape what happens to us in this world, because we have these very human capacities for repentance, for thinking about how we are as people, for prayer, for thinking about how we relate to God, and also for tzedakah, thinking about how we relate to others. And I think that is at least as good a backstory or kavanah for this prayer as the Rabbi Amnon story. But I hope I've presented you with a variety of options. But that will be my kavanah for Unetaneh Tokef for this year. So thank you guys so much. I feel like I should linger for a second, especially on Zoom, because I don't know, it's hard to look in both directions, but thank you. And if you at any point in shul have thoughts on any of the prayers that we've discussed, also after shul, but also like they're both long days, but they're all long days, 3 long days, 2 Rosh Hashanah, 1 Yom Kippur. I'm happy to discuss these or other tefillot further, and especially the ways that they resonate. And I guess your homework is, we didn't talk about the shofar part of this piece, which I think is also an important theme. So can think about those biblical resonances as well. All right. Thank you guys. Shana Tova. Bye guys. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much, Shana Tova.
Thank you, Shana
So glad
Tova.
this worked. Those of you baking, I hope it goes
great.
well. Okay, great.
It was great.